One of the most enduring legends about the Chernobyl disaster involves what has become known as the Bridge of Death. According to popular narratives that have circulated for decades, hundreds of residents of Pripyat gathered on a railway bridge near the city on the night of April 26, 1986, to watch the glowing reactor fire at the power plant. The story goes that these curious onlookers were bathed in lethal doses of radiation, and that every single person who stood on that bridge died within weeks or months from acute radiation sickness. The reality is far more complex and considerably less dramatic than the myth suggests. While it is true that some residents did venture out to observe the unusual spectacle at the power plant that night, there is absolutely no credible evidence that everyone who visited this location perished as a result. In fact, extensive investigations by historians and radiation experts have failed to produce a single documented case of someone dying specifically because they watched the fire from this bridge. The origin of the Bridge of Death myth appears to stem from a combination of factors. First, the bridge did exist, and some people certainly did gather there to observe the fire. The reactor core was exposed and burning, creating an eerie glow visible from Pripyat. Second, the early days and weeks after the disaster were chaotic, with incomplete records and confusion about casualties. Third, anti-Soviet propaganda during the Cold War era amplified worst-case scenarios about the disaster. What makes this myth particularly persistent is that it contains a kernel of truth wrapped in sensationalism. The area around Chernobyl was indeed heavily contaminated with radioactive particles. People who were outdoors in Pripyat during the first hours after the explosion were exposed to elevated radiation levels. However, exposure from standing on a bridge several kilometers away for a short period was not the instant death sentence that the myth portrays. Radiation exposure is cumulative and depends on multiple factors, including distance from the source, duration of exposure, and the types of radioactive particles present. While the liquidators who worked directly on the damaged reactor received massive doses, residents of Pripyat who were evacuated the following day typically received much lower doses. Many of these individuals are still alive today, decades after the disaster. The Bridge of Death myth serves an important psychological function in our collective memory of Chernobyl. It transforms a complex industrial and environmental catastrophe into a simple morality tale about the dangers of curiosity and governmental negligence. The image of innocent people unknowingly walking into a death trap is emotionally powerful and easy to understand, which explains why it has persisted despite lacking factual support. Modern research has helped to clarify what actually happened during those crucial first hours. While radiation levels were dangerous, they were not uniformly lethal throughout Pripyat. The Soviet authorities did fail to immediately warn the population about the severity of the accident, and this negligence did contribute to unnecessary radiation exposure. However, turning this into a story about a specific location where everyone died oversimplifies the tragedy and obscures the more nuanced realities of radiation exposure and its long-term health effects. Understanding the truth about the Bridge of Death is important because it helps us appreciate the actual scope and nature of the Chernobyl disaster. Rather than focusing on dramatic but unfounded stories, we should examine the documented casualties among emergency responders and liquidators, the long-term health impacts on exposed populations, and the environmental contamination that persists to this day. The real story of Chernobyl is tragic enough without embellishment. Perhaps no story from Chernobyl has been more dramatically retold than that of the three brave men who volunteered to drain radioactive water from beneath the damaged reactor. According to the widely circulated version of events, these heroes, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezbalov, and Boris Baranov, descended into flooded corridors beneath the reactor for knowing it was a suicide mission. The narrative claims they died within days or weeks from acute radiation poisoning, sacrificing themselves to prevent an even greater catastrophe. This story gained particular prominence through the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, which depicted the mission in harrowing detail and emphasized the fatal consequences for the divers. The series showed them as doomed men making a final, heroic sacrifice for humanity. This portrayal has become the dominant version of events in popular culture, shared millions of times across social media, and accepted as historical fact by countless people around the world. However, the truth is remarkably different, and actually demonstrates the resilience of the human body even under extreme radiation exposure. Alexei Anonenko and Valery Bespalov both survived the mission and lived for many years afterward. In fact, Anonenko was still alive and working in the nuclear industry decades after the disaster. Boris Baranov did die, but in 2005, nearly 20 years after Chernobyl, from causes unrelated to his radiation exposure during the diving mission. The mission itself was indeed critical and dangerous. In the days following the initial explosion, engineers realized that molten nuclear fuel, known as corium, was slowly burning to the reactor floor. Below the reactor were large pools of water used for cooling systems. If the superhot corium made contact with this water, the resulting steam explosion could have been catastrophic, potentially destroying the remaining 3 reactors at the Chernobyl plant and spreading radioactive contamination across an even wider area. The 3 men volunteered to enter the flooded compartments beneath the reactor to open drainage valves and release the water, eliminating the threat of a steam explosion. They wore diving suits and used underwater flashlights to navigate the dark, contaminated passages. The radiation levels in these areas were high, though not as apocalyptically lethal as often portrayed. The mission was successful. They located and opened the necessary valves, allowing the water to drain away. The myth of their immediate death serves a dramatic narrative purpose, but actually diminishes the real accomplishment of these men. Their survival is not a story of miraculous luck, but rather a testament to proper radiation safety protocols, limited exposure time, and the fact that even high radiation doses are not always immediately fatal. They received significant radiation exposure, certainly enough to increase their long-term health risks, but not enough to cause acute radiation syndrome that would kill them within days or weeks. This distinction is important for understanding how radiation actually works. The liquidators who died quickly from radiation exposure were those who worked directly on the exposed reactor core without adequate protection, receiving doses of 6 to 16 sieverts or more. The divers' exposure, while significant, was orders of magnitude lower because they were shielded by water and concrete and completed their mission relatively quickly. The persistence of the 3 divers died myth reveals our tendency to prefer simple, tragic narratives over complex truths. We want our heroes to make ultimate sacrifices, perhaps because it makes their heroism seem even greater. But the real story, that they completed an incredibly dangerous mission and mostly survived, is actually more inspiring because it shows that courage combined with knowledge and planning can overcome seemingly impossible odds. In the basement of Chernobyl's reactor lies one of the most infamous objects in the world, the elephant's foot. This mass of corium, a lethal combination of melted nuclear fuel, concrete, steel, and other materials, formed after the reactor explosion as superheated radioactive material burned through the reactor floor and solidified in the rooms below. The formation resembles a large, wrinkled foot, hence its evocative name. According to popular legend, anyone who looks at the elephant's foot will die within minutes, and even brief exposure to it is invariably fatal. The truth about the elephant's foot is frightening enough without exaggeration. When it was first discovered and photographed in December 1986, approximately 8 months after the disaster, the radiation levels emanating from it were approximately 10,000 Roentgens per hour. This is indeed an extraordinarily high level of radiation, enough to deliver a lethal dose in less than 5 minutes of direct exposure, and to cause serious radiation sickness from exposure of under 2 minutes. However, the notion that merely looking at the elephant's foot causes instant death is a dramatic embellishment. The famous photograph of the formation that circulated widely was actually a selfie of sorts, taken by a researcher who rigged a camera to capture the image while minimizing his exposure time. He survived this encounter. The actual danger comes not from looking at the object, but from the duration of exposure to the intense gamma radiation it emits. The elephant's foot represents one of the largest concentrations of corium ever observed. When nuclear fuel melts down, it reaches temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius and becomes an extremely dense, radioactive lava that flows and then solidifies. The Chernobyl corium contained uranium, plutonium, americium, and numerous other radioactive isotopes, making it extraordinarily hazardous. As it cooled and hardened, it trapped these materials in a solid but still intensely radioactive mass. Over the decades since 1986, the radiation levels from elephant's foot have decreased significantly due to radioactive decay. By the 1990s, levels had dropped to approximately one-tenth of their initial intensity, though this still represented an extremely dangerous radiation field. Today, with proper protective equipment and strictly limited exposure times, scientists can study the formation more closely than was possible in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. The formation continues to pose challenges for the long-term management of the Chernobyl site. The corium remains radioactive and will continue to emit significant radiation for thousands of years. Engineers and scientists must account for its presence when planning containment structures and decommissioning activities. The new safe confinement structure, completed in 2016, encases the entire damaged reactor building, including the basement areas where the elephant's foot resides. What makes the elephant's foot particularly significant from a scientific perspective is that it represents a unique material that had never been intentionally created before. Understanding its composition and behavior has provided valuable insights for nuclear safety and has informed planning for how to handle similar situations should they occur in the future. Samples have been carefully extracted for analysis, though obtaining these samples required elaborate remote-controlled equipment to minimize human exposure. The mythology surrounding the elephant's foot reflects our natural fear of invisible, deadly forces we cannot directly perceive. Radiation is terrifying precisely because it cannot be seen, smelled, or felt, at least not until it has already caused serious damage. By creating dramatic stories about instant death from merely viewing this radioactive formation, we give form to our anxieties about the unseen dangers of nuclear technology. The reality, while still deeply concerning, is more nuanced and ultimately more informative about the actual risks and challenges of nuclear accidents. One of the most persistent myths about Chernobyl is that the disaster was primarily caused by incompetent, undertrained operators who made catastrophic mistakes during a safety test. This narrative has been promoted in various accounts and even appeared in some official Soviet reports from the immediate aftermath of the accident. According to this version, the operators at Chernobyl that night were reckless and ignorant, pushing the reactor beyond safe parameters out of carelessness or desire to complete a test quickly so they could go home. The reality is considerably more complex and actually places primary blame not on the operators, but on fundamental design flaws in the RBMK reactor itself. While it is true that the operators made some decisions that violated normal operating procedures, these decisions were made in the context of a reactor design that was inherently unstable under certain conditions that the operators had not been properly trained to understand or avoid. The RBMK reactor had a dangerous characteristic known as a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this meant that under certain low-power conditions, the reactor would become increasingly unstable and difficult to control. If power levels dropped too low, creating voids or bubbles in the cooling water, the nuclear reaction would actually accelerate rather than slow down. This was the opposite of how most Western reactor designs worked and created potential for runaway reactions. On the night of April 25 to 26, 1986, the operators were conducting a safety test to determine whether the reactor's turbines could provide enough electrical power to run emergency cooling pumps during the brief period before backup diesel generators came online in the event of a power failure. This was actually a sensible test designed to improve safety. However, due to delays and complications, the reactor's power level dropped much lower than intended, putting it into a dangerous operating regime. At this point, the operator should have shut down the test and the reactor. However, they were under pressure to complete the test, and they may not have fully understood how dangerous the low-power condition was. They withdrew control rods to try to increase power, further destabilizing the reactor. When they finally recognized the danger and pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, it was too late. In fact, the design of the control rods themselves contributed to disaster. The RBMK control rods had graphite tips, and when they were fully inserted during an emergency shutdown, these graphite tips initially displaced cooling water before the neutron-absorbing parts of the rods could take effect. This design flaw caused a brief but catastrophic power surge, exactly the opposite of what the emergency shutdown was supposed to accomplish. Within seconds, the power level increased to hundreds of times normal operating capacity, causing a steam explosion that blew the 2,000-ton reactor lid off and exposed the core to the atmosphere. Subsequent investigations, particularly after the Soviet Union collapsed and more information became available, have made clear that while the operators made errors, they were operating a fundamentally flawed reactor design without complete information about its dangers. Soviet authorities initially blamed the operators to deflect criticism from the reactor designers and the decision-makers who had approved the RBMK design despite known safety issues. This blame-shifting served political purposes, but obscured the true technical causes of the disaster. The operators who survived the disaster, particularly Alexander Akimov and Leonid Topchinov, have been vindicated by later analysis. They were neither incompetent nor reckless. They were competent professionals working with inadequate information about the reactor's behavior and facing an impossible situation when the reactor entered unstable conditions. Many of the decisions that seem like errors in hindsight were reasonable given what the operators knew at the time. The real tragedy is that they were set up to fail by a reactor design that should never have been built in the configuration it was. One of the most contentious aspects of the Chernobyl disaster involves the actual death toll. The official Soviet figure, maintained to this day by Russian and international nuclear authorities, is that 31 people died as a direct result of the accident. These deaths included first responders and plant workers who received lethal doses of radiation during the initial emergency response. However, anti-nuclear activists and some researchers have claimed that the true death toll runs into the hundreds of thousands or even millions when accounting for long-term cancer deaths and other radiation-related illnesses. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes, though pinning down an exact number is genuinely challenging for methodological and scientific reasons. The 31 deaths directly attributed to acute radiation syndrome in the immediate aftermath are well documented. These were individuals who received radiation doses of 6 to 16 sieverts or higher while fighting the reactor fire or working in the immediate vicinity of the exposed core without adequate protection. Beyond these acute deaths, estimating long-term mortality becomes extraordinarily complex. Radiation exposure increases cancer risk, but cancer is already common in the general population, making it difficult to distinguish between cancers that would have occurred anyway and those specifically caused by Chernobyl radiation. Additionally, the exposed population was large and geographically dispersed across Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, complicating epidemiological tracking. The most comprehensive scientific assessment comes from the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCER, and the World Health Organization. These organizations have estimated that approximately 4,000 additional cancer deaths may eventually occur among the most highly exposed populations over their lifetimes. This figure is based on sophisticated modeling of radiation exposure levels, cancer risk coefficients, and population demographics. However, even this 4,000 figure is controversial and has been challenged from both directions. Some nuclear industry advocates argue it is too high, while anti-nuclear activists like those in organizations such as Greenpeace have produced estimates as high as 93,000 excess cancer deaths. The massive discrepancy stems from different assumptions about low-dose radiation effects, the size of the affected population, and the methodology used to attribute cancers to radiation exposure. One significant complication is the relationship between radiation dose and cancer risk at low levels. At high doses, the relationship is well established and linear, but at low doses, the kind received by people living in moderately contaminated areas distant from the plant, the picture becomes murky. Some researchers believe there is no truly safe dose of radiation, meaning even tiny exposures increase cancer risk proportionally. Others argue there is a threshold below which radiation causes no significant harm, or that low-level radiation might even be harmless or beneficial due to adaptive cellular responses. The only form of cancer definitively linked to Chernobyl in a statistically significant way is thyroid cancer in children who consume contaminated milk in the weeks following the disaster. Radioactive iodine, 131 concentrated in milk from cows grazing on contaminated grass, and children who drank this milk absorbed the isotope into their thyroid glands. Thousands of cases of thyroid cancer have been documented among this population, though the mortality rate has been relatively low due to effective treatment. This represents a genuine health catastrophe caused by Chernobyl, even though most victims survived. Other health effects remain more controversial. Increased rates of leukemia, cardiovascular disease, and various other conditions have been reported in exposed populations, but establishing clear causal links to radiation has proven difficult. Factors like post-Soviet economic collapse, increased alcohol consumption, psychological stress, and improved cancer detection methods all complicate the picture. The challenge of determining Chernobyl's true death toll reveals broader difficulties in assessing low-level environmental health risks. We want simple, definitive numbers, but reality is complex and uncertain. Saying either 31 deaths or 1 million deaths is misleading. The truth is that Chernobyl caused a relatively small number of acute radiation deaths, a moderate number of well-documented thyroid cancers, and a probably larger but difficult to quantify number of other cancers and health problems. This uncertainty doesn't diminish the tragedy. It simply reflects the honest state of our scientific knowledge about the long-term effects of a catastrophic radiation release. Search any online forum or social media platform for Chernobyl animals, and you'll find horrifying images. Pigs with extra limbs, fish with grotesque deformities, massive wolves, and other supposed mutants created by radiation exposure. These images have fueled a widespread belief that the Chernobyl exclusion zone is populated by radioactive monsters, animals transformed by radiation into creatures that would be at home in a science fiction movie. Some images show genuine deformities, while others are clearly fabricated or taken from completely unrelated contexts and falsely attributed to Chernobyl. The reality of wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is both more complex and more interesting than the mutant monster myth suggests. In the nearly 4 decades since the disaster, the zone has become an unexpected nature reserve. Without human habitation and hunting, populations of wolves, wild boar, deer, elk, and numerous other species have flourished. In fact, wildlife abundance in the zone now exceeds that of most European nature reserves. However, this doesn't mean radiation has had no effect on the zone's ecosystem. Scientific studies have documented subtle but significant impacts on animal populations. Research on small mammals like voles and mice has found elevated rates of genetic mutations, reduced lifespans, increased tumor formation, and changes in antioxidant systems that protect cells from radiation damage. Birds in the zone show elevated rates of albinism, deformities, tumors, and reduced brain sizes in some species. These effects vary greatly depending on the radiation levels in different parts of the zone. Animals living in hotspots with high contamination show more pronounced impacts than those in areas with lower radiation levels. Species also vary in their sensitivity to radiation. Some appear more resistant, while others show greater susceptibility to negative effects. One of the most interesting findings is the persistence of effects over multiple generations. Even animals born decades after the disaster, whose parents were never directly exposed to the initial fallout, still show genetic and health differences compared to populations outside the zone. This suggests that radiation has caused heritable genetic changes that continue to propagate through populations, though not in the dramatic, monster-creating way often portrayed. The insect population has been particularly affected. Studies have found reduced abundance and diversity of insects, particularly species like butterflies, bumblebees, and grasshoppers in the most contaminated areas. This has ecological ripple effects, as insects are crucial pollinators and food sources for other animals. The spider populations also show abnormalities, with some individuals exhibiting unusual web-building behaviors. Despite these documented effects, visitors to the zone today are often struck by how alive and thriving it appears. Forests have reclaimed abandoned towns, and animals are frequently visible. This apparent paradox, ecological devastation coexisting with wildlife abundance, has sparked scientific debate. Some researchers argue that the absence of humans more than compensates for radiation effects, allowing populations to boom despite elevated mutation rates and reduced individual health. Others are more skeptical, pointing out that short-term population growth doesn't necessarily indicate ecosystem health. If animals are dying younger and producing offspring with compromised health, the apparent success of wildlife in the zone might be temporary or unsustainable over longer time scales. The true long-term impact on ecosystems exposed to chronic low-level radiation remains an open question and an area of active research. What's clear is that the actual effects of Chernobyl radiation on wildlife are far more nuanced than either the mutant monster myth or the nature paradise narrative suggests. Radiation has had measurable negative impacts on animal health and genetics, but these impacts manifest as subtle changes in cellular processes, slightly elevated disease rates, and reduced longevity, not grotesque physical transformations. The zone is simultaneously a place of ecological damage and ecological recovery, a living laboratory, revealing both the resilience and vulnerability of nature when confronted with radioactive contamination. Among the most visually striking consequences of the Chernobyl disaster was the creation of the Red Forest. This was an area of pine forest that turned bright red and died in the weeks following the accident, killed by extreme radiation exposure as radioactive particles settled on the trees. According to popular accounts, the trees died instantly or within hours of the explosion, and the forest remains so radioactive today that entering it will cause immediate death or severe radiation poisoning. The actual timeline of the Red Forest death was somewhat different and reveals important information about how radiation affects living organisms. The pine trees didn't die instantly on April 26, 1986. Instead, they absorbed radioactive particles, particularly cesium and strontium isotopes, through their needles and bark. Over the following days and weeks, as radiation damaged the trees' cellular structures and disrupted their biological processes, the needles turned a distinctive ginger red color before dying. The Red Forest covered approximately 4 square kilometers and was located downwind of the reactor in the direction the radioactive plume traveled on the night of the disaster. This concentration meant the forest received some of the highest radiation doses of any ecosystem affected by Chernobyl, with absorbed doses estimated at 80 to 100 gray, enough to kill most living things. Trees are actually relatively resistant to radiation compared to mammals, so the fact that the pines died demonstrates the extreme contamination levels. In the aftermath, Soviet authorities made a controversial decision. They bulldozed the dead trees and buried them in trenches. This was intended to reduce the spread of radioactive contamination as the trees decomposed. However, burying highly contaminated organic material created its own problems, essentially creating radioactive waste dumps that continue to emit radiation and pose risks of contaminating groundwater. Some of these burial sites remain among the most radioactive locations in the entire exclusion zone. After the original pine forest died, something remarkable happened. Nature began to reclaim the area. Birch trees, which are more radiation resistant than pines, started growing in the cleared areas. Over the following decades, a new forest has emerged in what was once the Red Forest. This new growth appears healthy and vigorous in many areas, though soil contamination remains extremely high, and the trees themselves accumulate radioactive isotopes. Today, the Red Forest area is still one of the most contaminated parts of the Chernobyl zone, but it is not the instant death zone often portrayed. Radiation levels vary significantly depending on precise location. Some spots register relatively modest readings that would allow brief visits with appropriate precautions, while other hotspots emit dangerous levels of radiation that require strict avoidance. Ground-level radiation tends to be higher than at head height because most contamination is in the soil and leaf litter. The decomposition of organic matter in the Red Forest has proceeded abnormally slowly due to radiation effects on microorganisms and fungi that normally break down dead plant material. This has resulted in unusual accumulations of leaf litter and dead wood. Some researchers worry that this creates a significant fire hazard. If the forest were burned, it could resuspend and spread radioactive particles that have been locked in soil and organic matter for decades. Indeed, forest fires in the Chernobyl zone, including in areas of the Red Forest, have occurred multiple times since the disaster and remain a serious concern. These fires can temporarily increase radiation levels in surrounding areas, including in Kiev, as smoke carries radioactive particles. Fire prevention and suppression in the zone is complicated by the danger of sending firefighters into contaminated areas and by limited resources and infrastructure. The Red Forest exemplifies a broader challenge facing the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the long-term environmental persistence of radioactive contamination. Cesium-137, one of the primary contaminants, has a half-life of about 30 years, meaning it will remain hazardous for centuries. Plutonium isotopes in some areas have half-lives measured in thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. The red forest in similar contaminated areas will require monitoring and management for timescales that exceed normal human planning horizons, representing a genuine intergenerational environmental burden. One of the more disturbing myths about Chernobyl involves the firefighters and emergency workers who received lethal doses of radiation. According to stories that have circulated widely, these victims became so radioactive themselves that they couldn't be touched or approached without protective gear. Some accounts claim their bodies were buried in lead coffins or encased in concrete, and that their wives and loved ones who touched them also died from radiation exposure. This myth was unfortunately perpetuated by some dramatic depictions in popular media, including elements of the HBO Chernobyl series. The scientific reality is quite different and much less terrifying, though still tragic. When a person is exposed to external radiation, they do not become radioactive in any meaningful sense. Radiation passes through the body, damaging cells and DNA, but it doesn't make the person's tissues emit radiation themselves. The firefighters and plant workers who received lethal doses were not walking radiation sources dangerous to approach. The confusion stems from a misunderstanding about the difference between radiation exposure and radioactive contamination. If someone is exposed to radiation, like standing near an X-ray machine or a radioactive source, they receive a dose of radiation but don't become radioactive. However, if they come into contact with radioactive material, if they inhale radioactive dust or get radioactive particles on their skin or clothing, then they are contaminated and can potentially spread that contamination to others through physical contact. Some of the Chernobyl emergency responders were indeed contaminated with radioactive particles, particularly those who worked directly on the reactor roof or handled contaminated materials. Their clothing was heavily contaminated and had to be removed and disposed of carefully. In some cases, radioactive particles were embedded in their skin or hair. Medical staff treating these patients did need to take precautions to avoid spreading this contamination. However, once the victims were decontaminated, their clothing removed and their bodies thoroughly washed, they posed no radiation danger to others. This is why the wives and family members of Chernobyl victims who visited them in hospitals did not die from radiation exposure, contrary to some sensationalized accounts. While it's true that pregnant women were advised to limit contact with severely irradiated patients due to theoretical risks, the idea that simply touching or being near these patients was deadly is false. Many victims received prolonged visits from loved ones who suffered no radiation-related health consequences. The lead coffin myth has similar roots in misunderstanding. Some victims were buried in coffins with additional sealing to prevent any potential contamination from escaping if their bodies still contained radioactive particles. But this was a precautionary measure rather than a necessity due to dangerous radiation levels. The primary purpose was to provide psychological comfort and comply with burial regulations, not because the bodies were genuinely hazardous. The medical treatment of acute radiation syndrome patients at Chernobyl was challenging, but not because the patients themselves were radioactive. The challenge came from the nature of radiation injuries, which destroy the body's ability to produce blood cells, fight infections, and heal wounds. Patients essentially had compromised immune systems, making them vulnerable to infections. Medical staff wore protective gear primarily to protect the patients from bacteria and other pathogens, not to protect themselves from radiation. This myth has unfortunately contributed to the stigmatization of Chernobyl survivors and their families. People who lived in contaminated areas have faced discrimination based on unfounded fears that they or their children are somehow radioactively dangerous. These fears are scientifically baseless but have real social consequences, causing isolation and psychological trauma for people who already suffered enormously from the disaster. Understanding the distinction between radiation exposure and radioactive contamination is crucial not just for Chernobyl history, but for public response to any nuclear incident. Irrational fears about radiation turning people into dangerous radioactive sources can hamper emergency response efforts and prevent victims from receiving needed medical care and social support. The firefighters and emergency workers at Chernobyl were heroes who made enormous sacrifices. Compounding their tragedy with myths that they became toxic to their loved ones is both scientifically wrong and deeply disrespectful to their memory. A common narrative about Chernobyl attributes the disaster to Soviet cost-cutting and the selection of an inferior reactor design purely because it was cheaper to build. According to this story, Soviet authorities knew that RBMK reactors were dangerous and inferior to Western pressurized water reactors, but they chose the RBMK design anyway to save money and build nuclear capacity more quickly. This narrative fits neatly into Cold War-era stereotypes about Soviet technological inferiority and economic desperation. The historical reality is considerably more complex and reveals that the RBMK design was actually a deliberate choice based on specific Soviet priorities and constraints, not merely a cost-cutting measure. To understand why the Soviets built RBMK reactors, we need to examine the development of their nuclear program and the technical considerations that shaped reactor design in the 1960s and 1970s. The RBMK, Reactor Bolshoi Mashnasikyanny, or High Power Channel Reactor, was developed specifically to serve dual purposes. Like all early Soviet reactors, it was designed not just to generate electricity, but also to produce weapons-grade plutonium as a byproduct. The design's use of individual fuel channels that could be accessed and replaced while the reactor was running made plutonium production more efficient than Western designs that required complete shutdown for refueling. Additionally, the RBMK design used graphite as a moderator and light water as a coolant. This combination meant the reactors didn't require enriched uranium. They could operate using natural or slightly enriched uranium fuel. This was a significant advantage to the Soviet Union, which had large uranium reserves but initially limited uranium enrichment capacity. Western pressurized water reactors required highly enriched uranium fuel, which would have created supply bottlenecks for the Soviet program. The RBMK's large size, each reactor had over 1,600 individual fuel channels, also fit Soviet industrial capabilities and priorities. The modular design could be built using Soviet manufacturing capacity without requiring the massive, precision-manufactured pressure vessels that Western reactors needed. This wasn't about being cheap, but about adapting reactor design to available industrial infrastructure and capabilities. Soviet nuclear engineers were aware that the RBMK design had a positive void coefficient at low power levels, making it potentially unstable under certain conditions. However, they believed this risk could be managed through proper operating procedures and control systems. In this assessment, they were partially correct. RBMK reactors had operated for years without catastrophic accidents. The flaw was that the design required essentially perfect operator discipline and didn't have adequate engineered safeguards against human error or unexpected situations. What truly made the RBMK dangerous wasn't its basic design concept, but specific features that could have been improved. The control rods with graphite tips that cause a power surge during emergency shutdown were a particular design flaw. The lack of a containment building, a concrete and steel structure that would have contained radioactive releases even after an accident, was another critical omission. Western reactors included containment as a fundamental safety feature, while RBMK designers omitted it partly for cost reasons, but also because they believed the reactor design was inherently safe enough not to require it. After Chernobyl, surviving RBMK reactors were modified to address the most critical safety issues. Control rods were redesigned, additional safety systems were installed, and operating procedures were significantly improved. These modified RBMK reactors continued operating for decades after Chernobyl without experiencing similar accidents. The last RBMK reactor in operation at the Smolensk nuclear power plant in Russia was finally shut down in 2021, a testament to the fact that the design, with appropriate modifications and operational discipline, could be operated with acceptable safety. The lesson here isn't that the Soviets were stupid or recklessly cheap in building RBMK reactors, but that reactor design involves complex trade-offs between safety, economics, industrial capability, and strategic objectives. The RBMK design reflected Soviet priorities and constraints. Its fundamental flaw wasn't that it was cheap, but that it lacked defense in-depth safety features and had specific design elements that created dangerous instabilities under certain conditions. These flaws became catastrophic when combined with operational errors and inadequate safety culture, a combination that could potentially cause disasters with any reactor design that lacks sufficient safety margins. Perhaps no aspect of post-Chernobyl ecology has generated more conflicting narratives than the overall state of wildlife in the exclusion zone. On one hand, nature documentaries and some scientists have portrayed the zone as an unintentional nature paradise, a place where the absence of humans has allowed wildlife to flourish in unprecedented abundance. On the other hand, some researchers emphasize the zone as an ecological disaster area where radiation continues to cause significant harm to living organisms. Which narrative is correct? The answer is that both are true simultaneously, revealing a complex and sometimes counterintuitive ecological reality. The absence of human activity, hunting, farming, urban development, and industrial pollution, has indeed created conditions that many large animal species find favorable. Populations of wolves, wild boar, deer, moose, and bison have grown substantially within the exclusion zone. Some species rarely seen elsewhere in Europe, like lynx and brown bears, have been documented in the area. Casual visitors to the zone are often struck by the abundance of visible wildlife, leading to the impression of a thriving ecosystem. This is particularly dramatic in abandoned towns like Pripyat, where trees grow through buildings and animals wander streets once filled with people. The visual spectacle of nature reclaiming human spaces creates a powerful impression of ecological resilience and recovery. However, scientific studies that look beyond simple population counts reveal a more troubling picture. Research on bird populations has found that abundance and diversity of birds decrease with increasing radiation levels within the zone. Studies of specific species like barn swallows have documented elevated rates of abnormalities, tumors, and genetic mutations in highly contaminated areas. Insect populations show similar patterns, with reduced abundance and diversity in radiation hotspots. Small mammal studies have found that while populations exist throughout the zone, individuals in highly contaminated areas show evidence of oxidative stress, elevated mutation rates, shortened lifespans, and increased tumor formation. These effects don't necessarily prevent populations from persisting, but they indicate ongoing health impacts at the individual and potentially population levels. A crucial question is whether these radiation-induced health impacts are sufficient to outweigh the benefits of human absence. Some research suggests that in the most contaminated areas, radiation effects do significantly reduce animal populations below what they would be in equivalent habitats without contamination. However, even these reduced populations are often higher than in human-occupied areas outside the zone, where hunting and habitat destruction take a much greater toll. This creates a paradox. The Chernobyl exclusion zone may simultaneously be bad for individual animal health, but good for overall population numbers. An individual deer in a highly contaminated part of the zone might have elevated cancer risk and reduced lifespan compared to a deer in an uncontaminated forest. But because it faces no hunting pressure and has abundant food and space, it may still reproduce successfully. From a population perspective, numerous short-lived animals might be more successful than a smaller population of longer-lived individuals facing human hunting pressure. The ecological impact also varies dramatically depending on which species and which part of the zone is being examined. Large mammals that move extensively and have longer lifespans are generally less affected than small mammals with shorter lifespans and limited ranges. Trees and plants show different impacts than animals. Microorganisms, particularly fungi and bacteria involved in decomposition, have been notably affected, leading to slower breakdown of organic matter throughout the zone. Perhaps the most important insight from studying Chernobyl's ecology is that nature is simultaneously more resilient and more vulnerable than we might imagine. Life persists even in highly contaminated environments, but it doesn't emerge unscathed. The zone is neither a death zone devoid of life, nor a pristine wildlife paradise. It's a damaged or functioning ecosystem where life continues despite ongoing radiation stress, a living experiment in how ecosystems respond to chronic radioactive contamination. This nuanced reality doesn't fit neatly into either pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear narratives, which is perhaps why simplified versions of the story, either radiation killed everything or nature has completely recovered, tend to dominate popular discourse. The truth is more complex and, arguably, more interesting and instructive than either oversimplified narrative. The term liquidators refers to the hundreds of thousands of people who were sent to Chernobyl to clean up the disaster. According to popular myths, Virtually all of these individuals died within months or years from radiation exposure, making them a sacrificial army destroyed by the Soviet government's callous disregard for human life. Estimates of liquidator deaths in popular accounts sometimes run into the tens, or even hundreds of thousands. The reality, while tragic, is different from this apocalyptic narrative. The number of liquidators involved in Chernobyl cleanup operations over the years 1986 to 1990 is estimated at between 600,000 and 800,000 people. These included military personnel, miners, construction workers, nuclear specialists, and others assigned various tasks from building the sarcophagus around the destroyed reactor to decontaminating buildings to evacuating contaminated soil. Radiation exposure among liquidators varied enormously depending on when they worked, what tasks they performed, and how close they got to the damaged reactor. The most dangerous work was performed in 1986, particularly by those who worked on the reactor roof, clearing radioactive debris, or inside the reactor building. These workers received extremely high doses, sometimes several hundred millisieverts or even sieverts, during very brief work shifts that might last only minutes before they had to retreat due to reaching exposure limits. The biorobots who cleared the reactor roof have become legendary figures. These were soldiers and volunteers who manually shoveled highly radioactive graphite blocks and debris off the roof, throwing them back into the destroyed reactor. Each person could work for only 40 to 90 seconds before reaching their lifetime dose limit. Over 3,000 men participated in these roof-clearing operations, taking turns in an assembly line of sacrifice. Many of these most heavily exposed liquidators did develop health problems, including increased rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other conditions. Studies have found elevated mortality rates among liquidators who received the highest doses. However, even among the roof-clearing biorobots, not everyone died quickly. Many are still alive decades later, though often suffering from chronic health conditions. Liquidators who worked in later years, as radiation levels decreased and safety protocols improved, generally received much lower doses. A liquidator who worked on construction projects in 1989 or 1990 in areas away from the immediate reactor vicinity might have received only a few millisieverts of exposure, comparable to natural background radiation over a similar time period. For these individuals, long-term health risks are correspondingly lower. Determining exact mortality statistics for liquidators is complicated by several factors. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, disrupting long-term health monitoring. Liquidators were drawn from across the entire Soviet Union, making it difficult to track their health outcomes over time. Additionally, many liquidators were young men in 1986 and are now reaching ages where cancer and cardiovascular disease become more common in the general population, making it difficult to distinguish between radiation-induced illness and age-related disease. Studies that have successfully tracked liquidator cohorts have generally found elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers, particularly among those who receive higher doses. However, the magnitude of these increases is a subject of ongoing research and some controversy. The most reliable studies suggest increased risks ranging from 10 to 30% for heavily exposed liquidators, significant, but far from a universal death sentence portrayed in popular myths. The psychological and social impacts on liquidators have been profound and arguably underestimated. Many return from Chernobyl to face discrimination and stigma based on unfounded fears about radioactivity. Others suffered from what might be termed survivor's guilt or post-traumatic stress from their experiences. Economic difficulties during the Soviet collapse meant that promised compensations and benefits often failed to materialize. The combination of physical health concerns, psychological trauma, and socioeconomic difficulties created a toxic situation for many liquidators. The liquidators of Chernobyl deserve to be remembered accurately, not as a faceless mass who all died quickly, but as individuals who made varying degrees of sacrifice under a range of different circumstances. Some gave their lives or their health for the cleanup effort. Others contributed to the massive undertaking, while emerging relatively unscathed. All faced an unprecedented industrial disaster and did their best to contain it. Exaggerating the death toll doesn't honor their memory. It obscures the real complexity of what they experienced and achieved. One of the most dramatic moments in accounts of Chernobyl involves the threat of a second, potentially far more devastating explosion in the days following the initial reactor disaster. According to the story, molten nuclear fuel was burning through the reactor floor toward water pools below, and if the corium made contact with this water, a catastrophic steam explosion would occur with a force of multiple megatons, potentially destroying the remaining 3 reactors at Chernobyl and rendering vast territories of Ukraine and Belarus uninhabitable for centuries. This threat was indeed identified by Soviet scientists and engineers in the days following April 26, 1986. The concern was legitimate based on the extreme temperatures of corium, the molten mixture of nuclear fuel, control rods, structural materials, and melted concrete, which reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. If large quantities of this superheated material contacted water suddenly, the rapid steam generation could create an explosion. However, the scale of the threatened explosion has been significantly exaggerated in some accounts. Estimates suggesting megatons of TNT equivalent were not based on rigorous scientific calculations, but rather on worst-case speculations made in the chaos of the crisis. More realistic assessments suggest that while a steam explosion could have been severe, potentially compromising the other reactors and spreading additional contamination, it would not have had the civilization-ending consequences sometimes portrayed. The famous mission of the 3 divers who drained the water pools, discussed earlier, was undertaken specifically to eliminate this threat. Their successful mission did prevent a potential steam explosion, making it a genuinely important contribution to containing the disaster. However, the elimination of the specific threat didn't mark the end of concerns about the corium. The actual behavior of the Chernobyl corium has proven different from initial predictions. Rather than a single concentrated mass burning straight downward like a nuclear drill, the corium spread out as it descended through the reactor structure. It flowed through damaged areas, cooled and solidified in some places, and created multiple scattered deposits throughout the lower levels of the reactor building. The famous elephant's foot is one of these corium deposits, but it's not the only one. As the corium cooled over the days and weeks following the accident, the threat of a catastrophic steam explosion diminished. The material was still intensely hot and radioactive, but its temperature gradually decreased to the point where sudden contact with water would no longer produce an explosive steam release. The immediate crisis passed not because of a single heroic intervention, but through a combination of actions: draining water, cooling efforts, and simply the passage of time allowing heat dissipation. Interestingly, some of the corium did eventually encounter groundwater as it cooled, but this occurred gradually and didn't produce the feared explosion. Instead, the interaction between corium and groundwater became a long-term concern for contamination rather than an immediate explosion hazard. Radioactive isotopes from the corium could dissolve in groundwater and potentially spread contamination beyond the immediate reactor site, a slower, less dramatic, but still serious environmental problem. The second explosion narrative serves an important function in the Chernobyl story. It creates a ticking time bomb scenario that heightens drama and emphasizes the heroism of those who work to prevent it. This narrative structure is emotionally satisfying and makes for compelling storytelling. However, it also simplifies what was actually a complex, evolving set of threats and responses involving hundreds of decisions and actions by thousands of people over days and weeks. The true situation was that Soviet scientists and officials faced unprecedented challenges with imperfect information. They had to make decisions about containment strategies without knowing exactly where the corium was, how hot it remained, or how it would behave. Various threats, steam explosions, criticality events, the corium spontaneously restarting nuclear fission, fires, and contamination spread, all had to be assessed and addressed simultaneously. The focus on the single dramatic threat of a steam explosion, while not entirely unfounded, gives a somewhat misleading impression of the actual technical challenges faced. Understanding the reality of the second explosion threat helps us appreciate both the genuine dangers faced in the aftermath of Chernobyl and the limitations of human knowledge when confronting unprecedented technological disasters. We want clear threats and decisive heroic solutions, but reality is often messier, with multiple overlapping concerns addressed through sustained effort rather than single dramatic interventions. Pripyat was not evacuated immediately after the explosion at Chernobyl, and this delay is one of the most disturbing truths behind the myths surrounding the disaster. The city was home to nearly 50,000 people, mostly workers from a power plant and their families, living just a few kilometers from Reactor 4. In popular imagination, the evacuation is often portrayed as something that happened within hours, with loudspeakers waking people in the night and buses rolling in as the fire still burned in the distance. In reality, the explosion happened at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, but the evacuation order only came more than a day later, on the afternoon of April 27th. During those crucial 36 hours, residents went to work, children played outside, and families walked in the streets while an invisible cloud of radioactive particles drifted over their heads. That normal Saturday in Pripyat has become part of Chernobyl's dark legend. Parents took their kids to school and to the amusement park. Shops opened, and a wedding was held, all while radiation levels in parts of the city were already thousands of times higher than background. Windows vibrated from the initial explosion, and a strange glow could be seen from some parts of town, but officials said nothing concrete. Some residents noticed metallic taste in their mouths or headaches, classic signs of radiation exposure, but no one was told to stay indoors, close windows, or avoid fresh food and water. The Soviet instinct for secrecy, the fear of admitting failure in such a prestigious project, and the need to await orders from above all contributed to the silence. Even local doctors who suspected something serious was happening had little information and no authority to sound an alarm. When the decision to evacuate finally came, it was carried out with a deceptive sense of calm and control. On the afternoon of April 27th, loudspeakers in Pripyat announced that a temporary evacuation would take place. Residents were told to pack a few essential items, documents, and some clothes because they would be away for just 3 days. This detail is crucial. Almost no one believed they were leaving forever. People locked their apartments, left toys on beds, dishes on tables, and personal items in drawers, convinced they would return once the situation was under control. This is why the city appears so eerily frozen in time in modern footage and photographs. Pripyat is not a place hurriedly abandoned in panic, but a place politely and permanently abandoned under a lie. Buses lined up in long convoys on the roads leading into the city, and soldiers in uniforms with dosimeters took up positions to supervise the operation. Officially, the tone was calm and bureaucratic. Unofficially, many people sensed something was very wrong. Some noticed that soldiers kept their distance from buildings and vegetation, or that officers avoided sitting on the grass or touching surfaces. Parents tried to reassure crying children, telling them this was just a short trip. Families were separated if one member was on shift at the plant or away from home when the buses left. Many never saw their apartments again. Within a few hours, Pripyat was empty, its streets silent, swings motionless in the wind. Later, a powerful mythology grew around the evacuation. Tourist guides and media stories began to describe Pripyat as if people fled in terror with no warning at all, running from collapsing buildings or collapsing from radiation in the streets. In other versions, residents were rounded up at gunpoint or forced into buses with no belongings. These images fit the emotional expectations of a nuclear catastrophe, but they simplify a much more insidious reality. The true horror is not that people were driven out at gunpoint, but that they were calmly reassured, systematically underinformed, and removed from their homes under the pretense of a brief absence. It was an organized, efficient evacuation resting on disinformation. The cover-up went beyond local announcements. For days, Soviet authorities tried to downplay the severity of the accident to the world. Even as radiation monitors in Sweden and other European countries detected abnormal levels and forced the issue into the open. Inside the USSR, television and newspapers initially said very little, and many people living outside Pripyat, but within contaminated areas received no timely warning. Some children drank fresh milk from cows that had grazed on radioactive grass, leading to large thyroid doses that would manifest as thyroid cancer years later. The myth that the evacuation was fast and decisive hides how many people outside the city were left in dangerous conditions far longer than they should have been. Today, Pripyat stands as a monument to that mixture of control and deception. The iconic images, the Ferris wheel that never officially opened, the abandoned school with dusty gas masks scattered on the floor, the hospital with discarded equipment, feed a visual mythology of instant apocalypse. But the real story behind those images is that of a community that trusted the state, followed instructions, and was quietly erased from a map. Residents did not flee. They obeyed. The tragedy is not only that they were exposed to radiation, but that they were denied the truth when it mattered most. The frozen city is not just a symbol of nuclear disaster. It is a symbol of how a system built on secrecy can turn an entire population into unknowing participants in its own sacrifice. In the popular imagination, Chernobyl is often portrayed as an event that nearly rendered the whole of Europe uninhabitable, a catastrophe that missed total continental annihilation by a narrow margin. In many dramatic retellings, people say things like, if the wind had blown differently, all of Europe would have become a dead zone, or half the continent was almost erased forever. This kind of language feeds into a powerful apocalyptic fantasy. One explosion one night, and an entire civilization almost gone. It is emotionally satisfying, frightening, and very good for storytelling, but scientifically it is deeply misleading. The accident was serious, unprecedented, and global in its consequences, but it did not and could not threaten the existence of Europe as a whole. To understand what really happened, it helps to look at how radioactive material actually spreads in the atmosphere. When Reactor 4 exploded and burned, it released a complex mixture of radioactive isotopes into the air, including iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and various isotopes of plutonium. The fire sent these particles high into the atmosphere, where they were carried by winds over large distances. Rain and weather patterns then deposited this contamination in irregular, patchy patterns over parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and, in lower concentrations, over much of Europe. Some areas just a few dozen kilometers apart ended up with completely different levels of contamination simply because of how clouds and rain behaved in those days. Europe did not receive a uniform radioactive coating. It received a chaotic, uneven sprinkling. The worst contamination was concentrated relatively close to the plant, especially in parts of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus. In these areas, some villages and forests received extremely high doses of fallout and had to be permanently evacuated. Farther away, in countries like Sweden, Finland, Germany, and Austria, radioactive particles did arrive and were measurable, but the levels were much lower, enough to trigger alarms on radiation monitors and justify food restrictions and agricultural controls, but not enough to make those regions uninhabitable. The fact that radiation from Chernobyl was detectable across Europe does not mean that Europe as a whole was on the brink of becoming a wasteland. Detectable does not mean deadly. The myth that Europe almost died usually relies on a simplistic idea. If there had been one more explosion, or if the wind had shifted, half the continent would be gone. The reality is that there was no realistic mechanism by which Chernobyl could have wiped out Europe. A second steam explosion could have thrown more radioactive material into the air, contaminated more land, and made the disaster significantly worse, especially locally and regionally. But even the worst credible scenario would not have sterilized an entire continent. Nuclear weapons, with enormous explosive yields and intense prompt radiation, are designed to devastate large areas. Chernobyl was a reactor accident with no nuclear detonation, no mushroom cloud, and no mechanism to generate that kind of instantaneous continent-level destruction. What Chernobyl did do was create pockets of long-term contamination that still matter. Cesium-137, for example, has a half-life of about 30 years, which means significant contamination remains today in soil, forests, and river systems in parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, as well as in some hotspots in other European countries. In some regions of Belarus and Ukraine, restrictions on agriculture and forestry are still in place. Game meat, mushrooms, berries, and forest products can show elevated levels of cesium-137 decades after the accident. This is not Europe almost died, but its entire local economies and landscapes were quietly altered for generations. The more subtle danger is psychological and political. By framing Chernobyl as something that almost destroyed Europe, it becomes easy for people far from the epicenter to dismiss its real, localized damage. Since Europe survived, it couldn't have been that bad, some might think. The truth is that the disaster was both smaller and larger than the myth suggests. Smaller in that it did not threaten continental extinction, larger in that it permanently changed the lives and lands of millions of people in a complex, uneven way that is harder to dramatize. Whole regions did not die, but specific forests, fields, and communities were sacrificed in silence. Another myth says that entire regions remain so radioactive that simply walking through them would be fatal even today. In reality, radiation levels have declined substantially over time due to radioactive decay and weathering. Many areas that were once highly contaminated now have radiation levels that, while still above natural background, are not acutely dangerous for short visits. That does not mean they are safe for unregulated agriculture or permanent residence, but it does mean that the dramatic image of a glowing, deadly wasteland for thousands of kilometers is false. Chernobyl's legacy is not total annihilation, but chronic contamination, invisible, persistent, and uneven, shaping human and ecological futures in ways that are far less cinematic but far more real. Today, Chernobyl is no longer just a disaster site. It is a destination. Tourists sign up for day trips from Kiev. Influencers pose for photos in front of the rusting Ferris wheel of Pripyat, and documentary crews wander through abandoned schools and hospitals, hunting for symbolic images of decay. What was once a sealed, strictly controlled exclusion zone has partially transformed into a kind of dark theme park for nuclear catastrophe, framed as an opportunity to see the end of the world up close. This transformation has created a new layer of myth on top of the old ones. Myths about what the zone is now, who goes there, and what it says about the disaster itself. Dark tourism thrives on places where tragedy has left visible scars. Chernobyl's urban ruins, overgrown by vegetation, are perfect for this. Visitors explore empty apartment blocks, classrooms where gas masks litter the floor, gymnasiums with peeling paint, and the iconic amusement park that officially never opened. These images are powerful and, for many, irresistible. But they also shape the narrative. The focus falls on visual spectacle, rust, moss, and broken glass, at the expense of the lived experiences of those who once called these places home. The human beings of Pripyat risk being reduced to background characters in someone else's aesthetic horror story. At the same time, the exclusion zone has been mythologized as a place of extreme biological weirdness, a land of monstrous mutants and unnatural beasts. Stories and internet posts claim that wolves the size of horses roam the forests, that fish with several heads swim in the rivers, and that trees grow in bizarre, warped forms. Some photos and videos are outright fabrications. Others are rare anomalies exaggerated into the norm. As discussed earlier, there are measurable biological effects of radiation on animals and plants in the zone. Increased mutation rates, subtle deformities, changes in fertility, and shortened lifespans in some species. But these are rarely visible in the sensational ways people expect. Radiation's cruelty is usually at the microscopic level, not in cinematic monstrosities. Chernobyl's vegetation tells another misunderstood story. Instead of a gray, lifeless desert, the zone is overwhelmingly green. Forests have reclaimed roads and courtyards. Trees pierce roofs, vines crawl through windows, and entire neighborhoods are swallowed by undergrowth. To some observers, this looks like proof that nature heals everything, and that radiation has little lasting impact. To others, it's presented as a toxic jungle, where every leaf glows with invisible danger. Neither extreme is entirely true. The forest is indeed returned in force, but the soil beneath it can still hold significant contamination, and some areas, like parts of the Red Forest, remain among the most radioactive landscapes on Earth. Life is thriving, but it is thriving in a damaged, altered environment. Pop culture has amplified and reshaped all these elements. The HBO miniseries, video games like the STLKR series, and countless YouTube videos have turned Chernobyl into a modern mythology. In these stories, the zone is haunted by mutants, ghosts, conspiracies, and secret experiments. The disaster becomes a backdrop for narratives about government lies, scientific hubris, and fragility of civilization. Some of these retellings are careful and researched. Others sacrifice accuracy for drama. The result is that many people around the world now know Chernobyl more as a fictional setting than as a real historical event that continues to affect real people. Meanwhile, for residents of Ukraine and Belarus, and for former liquidators and evacuees, Chernobyl is not a symbol or a backdrop. It is a wound that never fully healed. Some people still live in contaminated territories, managing risk in everyday ways, deciding what food to grow, which mushrooms to pick, and what to feed their children. Others suffer from illness, anxiety, or social stigma linked, fairly or unfairly, to the disaster. For them, the sight of foreign tourists posing for apocalypse selfies in Pripyat can feel like a second erasure, turning their tragedy into entertainment. Chernobyl today exists on two levels at once. On the ground, it is a physical place, a patchwork of relatively safe areas, dangerous hotspots, active monitoring stations, wildlife, and ruins. In our collective imagination, it is something larger, a cautionary tale about technology, a horror story about invisible forces, and a canvas onto which we project fears about power, secrecy, and modernity. The myths about animals, vegetation, radiation, and the scale of the disaster shape how we talk about nuclear energy, environmental risk, and governmental responsibility. If this video helped you see Chernobyl beyond the myths, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it so that more people can discover the true story behind the disaster. Until the next video.